Hey, welcome everybody. Welcome back to our Bible study series for this week. We are reading and reflecting on the sort of textbook that's titled How the Bible Actually Works by Dr. Peter Enns. And of course, we're reading the Bible along with that and seeking to understand these wonderful collection of books and poems and stories and instructions that we use as such an important foundation for our faith. This week we are reviewing chapter 6 in the Bible, in the book. And as promised, it is more slam bang action starting from the very beginning. Uh, Dr. Enns kicks off this session with kind of a wild and woolly description and comparison of the universe as the people of the ancient world, including our beloved biblical writers, saw it. You got to put your mind back 2, 3, 4,000 years ago when people looked around, and I'm looking up because that's a big part of it, how they saw the world compared with what we have learned and are learning in the 21st century. Now, here's a quote somewhere around, page 118, 119. Uh, uh, Dr. Enns says King David wrote a really nice psalm about 3,000 years ago, praising God for how wonderful the heavens are. It is Psalm 19. And by the way, for those of you who will be in worship this week at Venice United Church of Christ, it's one of the worship texts that we're reading. So David wrote about how wonderful the heavens are, which is fine for him, but he had it easy. His universe consisted of a flat earth of manageable size with a dome overhead where the sun and the moon and the stars hung out. Up above that dome was where water was, and that's why the sky was blue. And above that, somewhere in the heavenly realm, where God was seated on his throne. All of this, from David's point of view, was probably a couple thousand years old or so, which I'm sure felt like a long time to him. With all due respect to Israel's primo king, David and I are not on the same page here. I'm more with the 17th century philosopher Blaise Pascal. And he talks about how during Pascal's time, the telescopes were being invented. They began to look out and see how big the heavens really were. And Pascal's quote is, "The eternal silence of these infinite spaces terrifies me." Now, I'd suggest that you go to page 119 in the textbook, okay? Page 119, and I want to read and invite you to follow along the first three full paragraphs, beginning about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down with the phrase "the known universe." Just listen to this because he does a great job of setting where we are based on the knowledge we have about what the universe is like. The known universe is about 13.8 billion years old. If we compressed those years into a single calendar year, with the Big Bang at the stroke of midnight on January the 1st, our galaxy would have been formed on March the 16th, our solar system on September 2nd, and the first multicellular life on December the 5th. It's almost Christmas, and we're nowhere near hairless bipeds. I feel like we're running out of time. So we'll get to us soon enough, but first, the dinosaurs have to arrive, which they do on Christmas Day. Primitive humans with stone tools don't arrive until 10:24 p.m. on New Year's Eve. The Israelites pop up about 11:59 and 53 seconds. Tick tock, there are 7 seconds left. Jesus a swift 2 seconds later, and the last 437 years of our planet's history occurs within the last second of the year. my projected lifespan would take up a little more than 1/10 of a second. That really puts it into perspective, doesn't it, when we say our lives are brief and that this world, this universe we live in, is much different, much older, much wider, much bigger than biblical writers like King David could ever have imagined. And so on page 120, um, Peter Enns says, no, King David, the heavens are not telling the glory of God in Psalm 19:1, at least not in the way we sometimes think, and not without a lot of heavy theological lifting. The heavens actually make me wonder if there is a God at all, at least the God I read about in the Bible, who is said to quaintly fashion everything like a potter at a wheel. Now, hold on. And if you have read the chapter, you probably understand he's setting us up. And we've learned he does this. He writes in a very imaginative and creative way, and sometimes purposely says things that make us go, "Wait, what do you mean? Uh, the heavens don't tell the glory of God." Well, I think you can make a case that they do. I mean, it is awe inspiring to look up in the sky at night, especially in a place where there's not much artificial light, and see the heavens filled with the stars. And the more we look at images from Hubble Space Telescope, James Webb Space Telescope, and see these incredible images from the universe, there's a very real sense in which they do tell us about the glory of God on a level beyond our language. But I think what he's trying to get at is it's not the same for us as it was for King David, who could look up and see what he understood to be a pretty limited world. And that literally was a dome. The sun, in his understanding, literally did rise up and journey across the sky and then set and go out of sight. Words that we still use, even though we know the sun doesn't rise, the earth turns and we can see it. Okay, so you get the idea. But he continues with his main thesis, and this is something I agree with, that the Bible is primarily designed to tell us something about God. That's what these stories, that's what these poems, that's what all of these wonderful writings are primarily intended to do. Now, there are other reasons and uses for scripture, but when we read these books, we're learning something about God. So, what do we do with the many, many odd and difficult things that these stories actually tell us? We've got some examples in here, and again, we could find many more. But what about the story in Genesis 6 of the day God decided to drown out the entire human and animal races, just going to drown the world out except for just a few? And, Noah and his family, which got in the ark, and the animals two by two, and then start the world all over again. That's quite a lot to think about. God is, what does that say about God? Or God in Leviticus chapter 24 that says, if you find somebody blaspheming, you don't say the right things about God, you need to take them outside the camp and throw rocks at them until they die. The same penalty for people who were caught sleeping with someone who was not their spouse. Take them out, stone them. That's worth dying for. Pretty severe, right? Well, he says many people of faith struggle regularly with the God of the Bible depicted in these stories, the God of the Bible, because this God seems locked in a world we don't recognize. The way forward feels like walking on a razor's edge between two options. You can either believe in the absurd God, or you can believe that the idea of God is absurd. Those really are two extremes. Of course, what he's doing is setting us up beautifully for what he really wants to say about the most basic question that we must all ask and answer. And that question is, what is God like? What is God like? And he says this is a wisdom question, and it's the primary purpose of the Bible. The God I read about in the Bible is not what God is like now in some timeless abstraction. And that's that. I can only look back at God, and God is just like that and hasn't changed. But really, how God was imagined then and then reimagined by ancient people of faith living in real times and places. We've been seeing that in the chapters we've read, right? That someone farther back in time may have told a story that depicted God in one certain way, and then someone maybe 100 years or 500 years or 1,000 years later would write something about God that imagined God or depicted God in some different way. The reason that happens is that we are all embedded in our own culture. We can never entangle ourselves from our here and now. That's true all the way through. People imagined and talked about God in ways that they could understand in their culture. And if we try to imagine a boundless God from within our bounded moment in time, well, that's the paradox of faith. And that is as inescapable for us as it was for the biblical writers. We reimagine God in ways that account for and make sense of our experience. We had a good bit of discussion in our live session about using the word imagine for God and then reimagine. And you may go, oh, well, God's not imaginary to me. God's very real. Using the word imagine in its truest and best sense is not the same as saying God is imaginary or we only think up on our own the ways to describe who God is. No, imagining is what we must do. In fact, we can only imagine what God is like. Comes from the word image, right? And so when we read a story from the Bible, or when someone tells us, like I had many wonderful Sunday school teachers when I was a kid and a young person, and they tell me things about God, things from the Bible. In my mind, I form an image. I must imagine what that story is telling me. And Dr. Enns has helped us see that this is the process of the Bible itself, people continually reimagining God in ways that account for and make sense of our experience. Now, the original languages of the Bible, it was written in Hebrew and Greek and a little bit of Aramaic. These were everyday normal languages. Okay. They're not special biblical. We call them the biblical languages. That doesn't mean that there's some secret code. If you can read Hebrew or Greek, you can understand something. If you read Hebrew or Greek, and why I sometimes explain a Hebrew word or a Greek word or occasionally an Aramaic word, it's not because it has secret knowledge. It's just that sometimes those words in a different language and a different culture are hard to express in the English that we speak today. But the point is, those were the languages of then, just like for most of us, English or Spanish or French or German or Farsi or some other language is our language for today. These were the words that people used to describe God, and they were taken from their everyday world. They just looked around. And so we have language like God is my shepherd. God is a rock. God is a strong fortress. It's like Fort Knox or something, right? God is a great king and a mighty warrior. These were things that they knew from their own world, knowing full well that God is not actually a shepherd walking around with a big shepherd's crook and herding us helpless sheeple in the ways we ought to go. That might be a good idea sometimes. And I'm not saying God doesn't every once in a while have someone or something reach out to kind of nudge us in the right direction. We know that those words are not literally true about God. God alone is God, and the words and the thoughts that we use can never be equated with God. That's why we don't say God is a shepherd. God is a rock. God is like a shepherd. God is like a rock. And saying that thing, those words are not God. They're just a way we're trying to imagine God. We're trying to understand God. If we make God equivalent to the words we use, what we're doing at that point is actually limiting God. We talked in class today about the struggle many people have with using the word Father for God. And some people say, well, I also want to use the word mother because that helps me understand more. The Bible actually uses some mother image for God. In class today, someone brought up the Bible's book of Job, which at one point says that the creation was housed within God's womb. Well, if you try to say, well, no, God is only a father, Jesus called God Father, which is true. It's one of the words Jesus used to describe God. And if you try to make that thing into God, if you try to make that absolute, then you would say, well, God can't have a womb. Fathers don't have a womb. Only mothers have a womb. Ta-ta! You just made the case. We can't limit God with our language. We're trying to imagine and understand God with our language. Our words are what we have to talk about God and communicate what we believe about God. And that's why on page 128, Dr. Enns says that our words are adequate within each cultural moment to talk about God. That's why David, who knew a lot about being a shepherd, could write the beautiful Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. The language we have is the language that we use. And, it's really a sacred and important gift and responsibility to be able to talk about God. Um, he notes Dr. Enns notes the Psalm 68 in this chapter. And again, we have very figurative language about God riding a chariot across the heavens. And that's what forms the thunder clouds. And you can imagine how and why an ancient person, I can remember when I was a kid and I would hear, thunder and know the storm was on the way. I used to imagine that God was bowling, right? And because I'd heard and felt the bowling ball rolling down the lane, and then pow when the pins were hit and would explode everywhere. You can understand how an ancient person would say, "Oh, that's God riding his chariot." And that's the sound of the wheels rumbling, and that's what makes the thunder and the lightning or the sparks flying off of those wheels. Well, I don't have any trouble understanding that. And that's why I love singing the hymn, Oh, Worship the King, in our worship services, that has that wonderful, I think, third or fourth stanza. The chariots of wrath, the deep thunder clouds form, and dark is his way on the wings of the storm. It's using that language from Psalm 68. I know God's not riding in a chariot, but we get it. Okay, it's just fine. This is the use of metaphor to get at what God is like. And we are always working on that language. The Bible's writers used language that worked for them, and we take the same ideas and we must find language that works for us in our own culturally appropriate ways. You see, we're all a part of our culture, aren't we? You can't help it. None of us is completely objective. You are you've been produced by the place you were born, the family you were born into, the time you were born, the area of the country where you lived, and I remember what a shock it was for me to realize that not everybody saw things the way I did. Not everybody was from a small town in West Tennessee and grew up in a Baptist dominant religious culture where, all of the things that go with that. I had to learn that there were people who thought differently than me because they were from a different place and they had different cultural ideas. Absolutely the same thing is true when we read all of these books, these stories in the Bible. The chapter closes with a discussion that might make some people uncomfortable. I'll admit it's a little odd for me. Dr. Enns says the Israelites most likely believed that many gods existed and that their God, whom they really called by a number of names, but I'm going to use the main Hebrew name for God. It's transliterated as capital Y, capital H, capital W, capital H. The Hebrew language has no consonants no vowels in it. It's all consonants. And so the closest we can get to it is a God whose name was Yahweh, Yahweh. And you may have heard the term Yahweh or others. That's one of the names that they used for God. Now, there are others. There is Elohim, there is El Shaddai, there is El Elyon. They talked about God in lots of ways, and every one of those had a particular meaning within their culture. Their faith was formed on the belief, though, that only their God, the one they named Yahweh, was worthy of their worship, even though their understanding most likely was there were other gods in the world, and certainly there were other gods that other people believed in. But they came over time to reverence this God above all the other gods, which is why you will read language like that in the Psalms and in other ancient books. Our God is greater than all the other gods. When it came to worshiping something, the Israelites had a choice. And we see that there are stories about them kind of wavering whether they were really going to stick with worshiping their great God or were going to do things like the story in the wilderness where they made a golden calf and thought they would worship it, the struggles they had with a god named Baal, the powerful story I remember learning in Sunday school about Samson. Remember, with the long hair, and he was strong until he was tempted and let his hair get cut, lost all of his strength, was captured by his enemies, the Philistines, Palestinians, and they put his eyes out and kept him in prison. And he prayed to God, let me one more time have the strength to bring glory to your name. And God granted him. And remember, the story ends, he said, place me between the pillars of the temple. Well, that wasn't the Jewish temple. It was the temple of a god named Dagon. And that the worship of that god Dagon, many people in Israel were beginning to decide, well, let's just believe in Dagon instead of Yahweh. And so Samson goes in and in that great climax pushes out the pillars of the temple, brings the whole house coming down, and the god Dagon was defeated. So the Israelites chose to worship the greatest God, the one God, and they named that God in many culturally appropriate ways. Now, we get hints in the Bible of the worship and remainders of other gods from the land. And if you go all the way back to the Bible story of Abram, who becomes Abraham, that's basically where the story of the Jewish people begins. And God calls Abram to leave his land, to leave his father, to leave his father's gods, and to go to a new land that God will show him. And that happens. You've got Abraham, and then you've got his son Isaac, and then you've got his son Jacob, who eventually is going to have his name changed to Israel. And that's where the Israelites come from. Well, Jacob ends up going back to the land of his grandparents, the land of where his uncles and aunts and all of the people from back home still lived. And he moves back into an environment where there are many gods. Every city, sometimes, every small nation, or even every household or clan had a god or some gods that they worshiped. And so in Genesis 31, there's a story of the day Jacob takes his wives and his children and all of his possessions, and he leaves the land of his father in law, who was also his uncle, Laban, and is going back to the land where Abraham and Isaac, where these the people of Israel were going to live. He's going to go back to the promised land and worship the God of his father and his grandfather. Well, Laban chases after them. Again, read in Genesis chapter 31. And Rachel, who is Jacob's wife and Laban's daughter, had taken the household gods. She had picked up those objects that were worshiped there. And when Laban comes after them, he's upset that Jacob has taken his children and his grandchildren. He didn't say goodbye, and he took the sheep and the cattle and all of those things. But he is most upset. He is incensed that he thinks Jacob stole the household gods. And so if you read the story, Jacob says, I didn't take them. What do you want to do? Look through all the tents? And he says, yeah. And basically he went through everybody's tent, looked through all their stuff, turned them over. It was a complete search until he got to the tent of his daughter, Rachel. And he says, I'm looking for the household gods. And she said, oh, are they missing? Well, yes, they're missing. Oh, I'm sorry. And he's looking around her tent. He says, stand up, let me see. Rachel was sitting on the household gods. And if you connect the whole story in Genesis, Rachel and her uncle Laban and Jacob's mother, who was, I've just forgotten Jacob's mother's name. You had Rebecca and you had, what am I doing here? They're all known for being really, really sly and wily. And Rachel is sly and wily. And she says, oh, I'm sorry, Daddy. It's my time of the month. It is the way for me in the way of women. And her dad says, oh, well, I better get out of here. He didn't want anything to do with that. And so Rachel hid the household gods from her dad. Now, it's a fun story and a funny story, and it has lots of meaning. But I call it to our attention today to understand how real the world was. The Israelites did worship the one God, but they also understood that there might be other gods in the world. And so, next session, when we read chapter 7, we're going to start with the story of another god in the land. We're going to read the story of the god Chemosh. 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 And the story of the Moabite king who sacrificed his son his only son. He killed him on the walls of the castle and prayed to Shamash that he would spare them in battle and help him defeat the army of Israel. And it happened. A prayer to another God. And the story in the Bible is that God apparently answered the prayers that day. I guess we'll have to wait till next week to finish that. Thanks for tuning in. If there's any way I can help you, do not hesitate to get a hold of me. My email, john.fairless@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you, and we'll see you next week for chapter 7.